In the rugged highlands of West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains stretch like an endless wall of shadow and stone. For centuries, these ridges have swallowed men whole merchants, surveyors, and pioneers who vanished between towns, their fates explained away by wolves, bandits, or the merciless elements. Yet, among these tales of misfortune, one story stands apart, darker than all the rest. It is the story of Hollow Inn, a place that promised salvation to the weary but delivered something far more sinister. Travelers along the Wilderness Road, the artery that carved through the wilderness and carried settlers westward, spoke of Hollow Inn in reverent tones. It was said to be a sanctuary, a warm beacon against the peril of the mountains. Riders who arrived half-frozen from river crossings found roaring hearths, hearty stews, and feather beds. Cattlemen trudging through storms discovered not just shelter, but an uncanny sense of belonging. Some men confessed that departing felt like leaving family behind. Others, their eyes lowered, admitted that the inn's comforts felt almost intoxicating. But by the 1840s, whispers began to curdle. Merchants carried stories of wagons abandoned on lonely passes, their drivers never seen again. Stray horses were found wandering meadows with saddles still strapped. And when frightened men retraced the missing travelers' paths, the last place each had been seen was Hollow Inn, under the watchful eyes of the Blackwood sisters. The inn itself had humble beginnings. Olrich Blackwood, the family's patriarch, was among the first settlers to tame this unforgiving terrain in the late 1700s. He cleared the forest, built a cabin of oak timbers, and established fields along the valley. His only son, Corvin Blackwood, inherited both the land and the burden of keeping it. Unlike his father, Corvin was a man of peculiar habits, fascinated by superstition and the darker corners of faith. Some said he spent nights with books written in Latin, tracing prayers that blurred the line between holy blessing and forbidden rite. By the time Corvin died of consumption in 1831, he left behind not a son to carry his name, but 4 daughters. The land, the livestock, the mill, and most importantly the house by the Wilderness Road, all fell into their hands. In a patriarchal society, this inheritance was regarded with suspicion. 4 unmarried women owning and operating a property on their own was nearly unheard of. Yet they proved resourceful, and the family estate transformed into an inn that would be known across the mid-Atlantic as Hollow Inn. The sisters could not have been more different. Prudence Blackwood, the eldest at 26, possessed a gaze that seemed to weigh and measure every person who crossed her path. She spoke little, smiled less, and kept the accounts with the precision of a banker. To her, guests were not men, but opportunities calculated risks and potential profits. Isolde Blackwood, 2 years younger, was a contrast as striking as silk against stone. With raven-dark hair and a voice soft as dusk, she carried a beauty that unsettled as much as it attracted. Men who dined at Hollow Inn often lingered longer than planned, drawn not only to the fire, but to Isolde's delicate glances and whispered words. More than one traveler confessed that leaving felt like tearing away from an enchantment. Morwenna Blackwood, at 22, inherited their mother's gift for herbs. To neighbors, she was a healer. To travelers, she was the quiet figure behind the kitchen door, blending teas that soothed coughs and preparing broths that revived the weak. Yet the plants she cultivated in her garden were not all benign. Foxglove, nightshade, and hemlock grew alongside sage and thyme. Few questioned why. Fewer still realized the significance until it was too late. And then there was Hester Blackwood, the youngest, only 16 when Corvin was lowered into the earth, with a laugh unburdened by suspicion and eyes that gleamed with innocence. She became the inn's most effective disguise. even the wariest traveler felt their doubts soften under her cheerful chatter. She seemed incapable of malice, and in that seeming lay her power. Together, these 4 young women shaped Hollow Inn into something remarkable. Guests wrote letters praising its comfort, merchants altered routes to spend a night there, and drovers spoke of it in towns hundreds of miles away. For over a decade, Hollow Inn was more than an inn, it was a myth, a place where the wilderness yielded, for a brief moment, to warmth and welcome. Yet the mountains have always concealed secrets. In Appalachia, isolation is both shield and sword. What kept outsiders away also kept questions from being asked. A man could vanish between one town and the next, and his absence might go unnoticed for weeks. Death was common fever, animal attack, robbery. To lose track of a traveler was no scandal. It was the rhythm of frontier life. And it was within this rhythm that the Blackwood sisters began to weave something darker. Their combined gifts, Prudence's cold calculation, Isolde's allure, Morwenna's knowledge of herbs. Hester's disarming innocence formed a web as dangerous as any spun by spiders clinging to the inn's rafters. What began as hospitality soon shifted into something else, something predatory. By the winter of 1843, too many wagons lay abandoned. Too many men had failed to return. The pattern, at first overlooked, was becoming undeniable. The last place they had been seen, the last warm fire they had enjoyed, was inside Hollow Inn. And as the snow deepened in those mountains, so too did the suspicions. Hollow Inn was no longer just a sanctuary whispered about in reverence. It was becoming something else entirely, a name carried in hushed tones, tinged with a dread. The Inn of the Blackwood sisters, the place from which men did not return. The story of Hollow Inn cannot be understood without first tracing the legacy of the family who built it. The Blackwood name carried weight long before the sisters became notorious. It was Olrich Blackwood, the grandfather, who first hacked a clearing out of the forest at the close of the 18th century. He was a man of iron conviction, remembered by settlers as both a pioneer and a figure of severity. Olrich laid the foundation for the family's holdings, a stone cabin, a mill by the creek, and fenced fields that stretched across the valley. To him, survival meant control over the land, over livestock, and over kin. His son, Corvin Blackwood, inherited not only the soil but the temperament. Corvin, however, differed in one crucial way. He carried with him a fascination with things unseen. Neighbors whispered that he kept books in Latin, obscure treatises on alchemy and medicine. At night, lanterns glowed from his study long after the household had gone still, and some swore they heard him murmuring in languages foreign to the ear. Whether he sought knowledge, healing, or power, no one could say. What is certain is that when consumption hollowed his lungs in 1831, the land passed not to a son, but to 4 daughters, for the Blackwood sisters. Inheritance was both gift and curse. In a frontier society where property was expected to pass from father to son, their claim unsettled neighbors. Yet there was no disputing Corvin's will. Every acre, every timber, every animal belonged to them. Prudence Blackwood, 26, assumed command as naturally as if she had been groomed for it. Thin-faced and sharp-eyed, she was said to carry herself like a magistrate, each movement deliberate. She organized accounts, bargained with traders, and decided which fields would be planted. Where her sisters hesitated, she calculated. Where they doubted, she demanded. In her hands, the estate became more than land, it became enterprise. Her sister, Isolde, 2 years younger, seemed fashioned from entirely different cloth. With raven hair and a face that unsettled even women, she possessed a magnetism that defied explanation. She was quick with laughter, quicker with sympathy, and possessed a strange ability to mirror the emotions of those around her. To lonely men, she appeared as comfort. To ambitious ones, she became a confidant. To the devout, she assumed the air of piety. Hollow Inn's charm, many later testified, was not its food or its beds, but the way Isolde made each guest feel chosen. Morwenna Blackwood, at 22, was neither beautiful nor commanding. She lived among jars, roots, and dried leaves. From their mother, she had inherited not only recipes for poultices, but a deeper lore of plants lore that carried shadows. Foxglove to quicken or still the heart, pokeweed to mimic fever, nightshade to dim the senses. To neighbors, she was a healer. Summoned when children coughed or cattle took ill, but within her notebooks, written in her cramped hand, were observations of symptoms that no patient survived. Hollow Inn's kitchen, under Morwenna's guidance, became a place where sustenance and poison were indistinguishable. The youngest, Hester, was 16 when Corvin died. She had soft features, a nervous smile, and a voice pitched with girlish eagerness. Travelers who met her often described her as angelic, incapable of guile, and perhaps she believed herself so. Yet her role would prove vital. Innocence, when displayed convincingly, is its own form of camouflage. A guest who might suspect Prudence's coldness or Isolde's allure could not sustain doubt in the presence of Hester's naive questions about their families and hometowns. She was the perfect listener, the perfect child sister, and the perfect mask. Together, these four formed a constellation of traits rare enough to attract notice, and dangerous enough to corrupt. Prudence brought discipline, Isolde seduction, Morwenna knowledge, and Hester disarming charm. Each talent alone was survivable. Together, they became an arsenal. By the mid-1830s, Hollow Inn had transformed. What had once been a farmhouse became a two-story structure of oak beams and stone. 6 guest rooms lined the upper floor, each with feather mattresses and heavy quilts. Downstairs, a vast common hall boasted twin hearths large enough to roast whole deer. The air smelled of wood smoke and Morwenna's stews. A barn and stable provided security for wagons, while a millstream ground their grain. On the edge of the property stood a family cemetery, headstones tilting beneath moss, markers of the Blackwood dead. Travelers who stayed at the inn wrote glowingly in letters home. A Charleston merchant praised the refined hospitality of the sisters. A Baltimore surveyor marveled at the knowledge of the land displayed by Morwenna. Cattle drovers told of evenings by the fire when Isolde sang songs that left hardened men in tears. Hollow Inn's fame spread so wide that men altered their routes to experience it, braving the perils of mountain passes for the chance of comfort within its walls. And yet, even in those years of golden reputation, shadows gathered. The Blackwood sisters were isolated, answerable to no father or husband, their land too remote for easy supervision. Neighbors admired their industry but muttered of their independence. Whispers circulated of Isolde's strange power over men, of Morwenna's garden filled with plants better suited for poison than medicine, of Prudence's calculating stare. None of these suspicions were voiced aloud, for Hollow Inn's generosity was undeniable. But in the mountains, secrecy thrived. It was in this crucible of grief, ambition, and isolation that the sisters' true reputation began to take shape. They were no longer merely 4 young women defending their inheritance. They were something more dangerous, a collective force, bound by blood, sharpened by necessity, and hidden by geography. Travelers would continue to come, drawn by word of mouth, by songs of comfort in the wilderness. And most would leave again, carrying stories of warmth and hospitality. But not all. Some never returned to their families, their names fading into the silence of the frontier. The ledger of Hollow Inn grew fat with profits. The Blackwood's reputation as capable women swelled. And yet, beneath the polished veneer of success lay the beginning of a pattern, one that would not be noticed until it was far too late. because in those mountains, where oversight was scarce and memory was fragile, 4 sisters discovered a truth that would shape the next decade. Privacy is the perfect soil in which dark seeds may take root. The first disappearance linked to Hollow Inn was, at the time, dismissed as nothing more than frontier misfortune. The year was 1832, and the mountains were already notorious for swallowing men without warning. Yet the case of Bartholomew Cray, a merchant from Maryland, would later be recognized as the Blackwood sisters' first deliberate act of murder, the moment when hospitality crossed into predation. Cray was 40 years old, a widower with no children. Records describe him as a man of means, known in Baltimore's markets for his shipments of tobacco and iron tools. That winter he set out on a journey into western Virginia, carrying with him a purse of gold coins and promissory notes. His plan, according to letters found later, was to purchase livestock and land parcels along the frontier. A risky but potentially profitable investment. He traveled alone. On a November evening, as snow began to fall over the ridgelines, Cray's horse approached the bend in the wilderness road where Hollow Inn stood. Inside, the sisters had already lit the great hearths, and the glow from the windows spilled into the dark like a promise. Prudence greeted him first, her tone measured but warm, noting immediately the quality of his coat and the bulging saddlebags. Behind her, Isolde appeared with a smile that caught in the firelight, while Morwenna set down a tray of steaming cider. Hester, as always, offered her shy laughter, asking whether he had come from far away. To a man who had spent weeks alone on rough trails, the welcome was overwhelming. For 3 days, Cray remained at the inn. The sisters executed their roles with chilling precision, though no guest would have recognized the performance. Prudence engaged him in long discussions about trade and property, giving the impression of respect for his intellect. Isolde listened with tender attention, her eyes never straying, her voice soft as silk when she asked about his late wife. Morwenna served him teas that soothed his travel-worn body, infusions that dulled his suspicion while sharpening his dependence. And Hester, ever the innocent, asked him to describe the city of Baltimore, marveling at streets lined with lamps and carriages. Cray wrote in his journal, later recovered from among his possessions, that Hollow Inn felt unlike any place he had visited. "They treat me," he scribbled on the second night, "as though I were kin. The youngest, Hester, reminds me of my niece. And Isolde, there is in her manner something of the angel, though I confess I dream of her even while awake." It was precisely this mixture of longing, gratitude, and weariness that the sisters had begun to recognize as opportunity. Prudence, ever the strategist, observed that a man with money but without close kin was ideal. Isolde confirmed that Cray's heart was soft, vulnerable. Morwenna prepared her powders. On the 4th evening, as snow drifted silently past the shutters, Cray sat by the fire with Isolde. She poured him a glass of a spiced rum, her hand brushing his as she passed it. He confided that the road had grown lonelier since his wife's death, that sometimes he wondered if God himself had abandoned him. Isolde leaned closer, whispered that no man was meant to be alone. To Cray, it felt like redemption. To the sisters, it was the signal. The next morning, Cray prepared to depart. His horse was saddled, his purse secure. He thanked Prudence for her management, Hester for her cheer, and Isolde for her kindness. As he mounted, the sisters bid him farewell with smiles that concealed their intent. He rode into the woods, unaware that death awaited. Half a mile down the trail, in a thicket where the snow muffled all sound, Olrich Kappell, the German laborer who worked the estate, stepped from the trees. In his hands he carried a blacksmith's hammer. Cray never had time to cry out. The blow to the back of his skull was swift, final. His body crumpled into the snow, blood seeping into white drifts. The corpse was wrapped in canvas. carried under cover of night into a shallow pit near an outcrop of stone. Morwenna scattered herbs over the site, a gesture both practical and ritualistic. By dawn, there was no trace. Only the horse remained, later discovered weeks away, wandering without rider. Back at the inn, the sisters gathered around their kitchen table. Prudence stacked the gold coins with the same composure she used for ledgers. "This is more than a year's profit," she remarked coldly. Isolde, still wearing the expression of sympathy she had shown Cray, murmured, "He would have given us anything." Morwenna scribbled notes in her journal, recording the dosage, the timing, the effect of her concoction. Hester sat silent, her hands folded, her face pale but resolute. Bartholomew Cray was never seen again. In Baltimore, acquaintances assumed he had chosen to remain in the West, pursuing land ventures. His absence raised no alarm. Men disappeared often enough in those years. Only decades later would investigators connect his name to Hollow Inn, placing him as the first known victim. But for the sisters, Cray's death was not an accident of circumstance. It was a revelation. They had discovered not only the ease with which a man could be erased, but the profit it yielded. The wilderness, they realized, offered perfect concealment. And the isolation that once threatened their survival now protected their crimes. From that winter forward, Hollow Inn was no longer merely a place of rest. It became a web. Guests arrived weary, hopeful, unsuspecting. Some departed with warm memories. Others never left the mountains at all. And with every disappearance, the sisters refined their craft, weaving hospitality and horror into a single, seamless enterprise. The death of Bartholomew Cray marked more than the loss of a solitary merchant. It was the beginning of a system one that the Blackwood sisters would perfect over the next 2 decades. What began as opportunity hardened into ritual, a structure as methodical as it was merciless. By the spring of 1833, Hollow Inn was no longer merely a stop on the wilderness road. It was a hunting ground. Prudence Blackwood, the eldest, assumed the role of strategist. Cold, meticulous, she devised rules that transformed murder into a business. Her criteria were simple but devastatingly effective. The ideal target was a man traveling alone, one who carried wealth but lacked close kin or obligations that might spark inquiry. She instructed her sisters to listen for certain details. Did the guest mention family? Were there partners awaiting him? Was his route flexible? The fewer ties, the better. Lonely men leave the faintest footprints. She is recorded as saying years later during her interrogation. Isolde became the lure. With her beauty and disarming empathy, she played the part of confidant, mourner, or admirer depending on what the guest most desired. If a man was grieving, she offered tender understanding. If he was ambitious, she mirrored his dreams. To the pious she appeared devout, quoting scripture with careful reverence. To the hardened soldier, she became playful, almost reckless. She had, investigators later concluded, a chameleon's ability to adapt her entire persona to ensnare a heart. Men arrived strangers and departed convinced they had found a kindred spirit. Morwenna was the hand of death itself. She expanded her mother's apothecary knowledge into something darker, cultivating a secret garden behind the inn. There, nestled between sage and thyme, grew foxglove, belladonna, water hemlock, and pokeweed. Each plant was catalogued in her notebooks with a chilling precision dosage, symptoms, duration until death. A small amount of pokeweed would cause cramps and nausea, easily dismissed as food poisoning. Foxglove, carefully measured, could mimic heart failure. Nightshade brewed into tea blurred a victim's senses, rendering them pliant to suggestion. Morwenna's genius lay not only in killing, but in killing believably crafting deaths that mirrored natural afflictions common to frontier life. Hester, the youngest, played her role with unnerving subtlety. Her wide-eyed innocence disarmed suspicion even in the most skeptical guest. While pouring cider or playing the family's small piano, she would ask seemingly harmless questions. Where had they come from? Did they have family waiting? How much longer would they be traveling? She gathered intelligence with the ease of a child making conversation. Yet the details she learned: whether a man was married, whether he was expected at a destination, whether he carried money, were fed back to Prudence, who decided his fate. The murders themselves unfolded with a clinical rhythm. Once a victim was chosen, Isolde deepened her emotional hold, ensuring the man extended his stay. Morwenna introduced her poisons gradually, softening his resistance. When the final act came, it was carried out with efficiency. Sometimes the man died in his bed, apparently of fever or heart failure. Other times, Olrich Kappell, the German laborer, was dispatched to intercept him after departure, ending his life with hammer or blade in the woods. Ulrich's role was crucial. Hired originally to tend livestock and repair fences, he became an accomplice in the disposal of bodies. Strong, silent, and obedient, he transported corpses to hidden caves along the ridge. These caves, accessible only through a narrow crevice behind a rockfall, became the sisters' charnel house. Wrapped in canvas or weighted with stone, the bodies were left where mountain dampness and soil would hasten decomposition. Ulrich also sorted personal effects. Valuables were brought back to Prudence. Identifiable items burned or buried separately. To shield themselves from suspicion, the sisters cultivated appearances of piety and generosity. They attended church services in the nearest settlement, contributed to local causes, and maintained friendships with neighboring families. Prudence lent money to farmers. Isolde organized seasonal gatherings. Morwenna offered medicines to the sick, while Hester helped at Sunday school. This web of social integration ensured that when questions arose, the community itself vouched for them. As one neighbor testified years later, they were the very soul of respectability. I'd sooner have doubted my own kin than those girls. Even the family cemetery was woven into their deception. At its edge, among the genuine graves of Olrich and Corvin Blackwood, new headstones appeared from time to time. These stones, engraved with fabricated names, concealed the burials of certain victims. To outsiders, it seemed a family honoring its dead. In reality, it was camouflage. By the late 1830s, Hollow Inn's killing system had become so refined that disappearances raised little alarm. The frontier was perilous. Men vanished constantly. Some were said to have joined expeditions further west. Others were assumed to have died of fever or misfortune. A merchant might simply be believed to have resettled. The Blackwoods exploited this uncertainty, spacing their crimes carefully so as not to create obvious patterns. Never more than 4 or 5 victims a year, never 2 from the same town. Always enough time between deaths for suspicion to fade. What made their enterprise especially chilling was the sense of normalcy. Guests arrived to roaring hearths, spiced rum, and songs sung by Isolde's haunting voice. They left believing they had found solace in the wilderness. Only some never left at all. Later, criminologists would describe the Blackwoods as a perfect storm of psychological traits: Prudence, the calculating sociopath; Isolde, the manipulative seductress; Morwenna, the sadistic poisoner; Hester, the innocent mask. Alone. Each might have lived a respectable, even unremarkable life. Together, they created one of the most efficient killing enterprises in 19th century America. And it had all begun with a single man, Bartholomew Cray. His disappearance was explained away as another casualty of the wilderness. But his death revealed to the sisters something far more intoxicating than wealth: the knowledge that they could make people vanish without consequence. From that point forward, Hollow Inn was no longer merely an inn. It was a machine. Every gesture of kindness, every shared glance by the fire, every sip of herbal tea was part of a system designed to draw men into its orbit and erase them from the world. By the middle of the 1830s, Hollow Inn was no longer just a lodging house hidden in the mountains. It had become a legend whispered across taverns and trading posts from Virginia to Maryland, even as far as the docks of New Orleans. Travelers spoke of it with the same reverence reserved for grand hotels in Richmond or Philadelphia. They said that no matter how weary the road, one night at Hollow Inn restored the spirit. The irony, known only decades later, was that some spirits never left the inn at all. The Blackwood sisters had perfected a double life. By day, they were the very image of frontier hospitality. Prudence welcomed guests with stern competence, keeping ledgers neat and provisions stocked. Isolde charmed visitors at the fireside, playing hostess with uncanny intuition. Morwenna provided cures for coughs and fevers, her remedies praised as near miraculous. Hester, the youngest, ran about with the careless joy of youth, asking strangers about distant cities and drawing laughter from even the most hardened men to the outside world. They seemed miraculous, four women maintaining an estate, prospering in the wild, and offering a sanctuary unmatched by any other. Their prosperity was not imagined. By 1837, Prudence had expanded their legitimate operations. The inn offered not only lodging and food, but also horses for rent, guided hunts through the valleys, and barrels of whiskey distilled on site. The whiskey in particular became coveted, traded by merchants who carried its name into distant ports. Every legitimate coin earned only further concealed the illegitimate wealth taken from men who would never return home. The timing favored them. The nation was surging westward, and with every wagon train, drover, or merchant caravan came a steady stream of strangers whose faces were unknown and whose absences could be explained away. Some were immigrants chasing opportunity. Others were loners cut adrift from family ties. For the sisters, these were perfect prey. The roads filled their tables with men who carried gold, silver, promissory notes, and most importantly, loneliness. Surviving records describe the sheer variety of their clientele during these years. A Charleston lawyer, a Philadelphia surveyor, cattlemen from Tennessee, fur traders from the Ohio Valley, all spoke of Hollow Inn's warmth. Some even returned multiple times, becoming semi-regular patrons. Yet woven among these accounts are gaps names that appear once and then vanish from all subsequent records. They were absorbed into the silence of the frontier, their absence explained by the usual hazards of travel. The inn itself became a showpiece of frontier prosperity. The common hall grew grander, with polished oak floors and curtains of heavy wool dyed in deep crimson. New feather beds were purchased from Baltimore. A pianoforte, rare for such an isolated region, was delivered in 1839 and became Hester's pride. Guests marveled that such refinement existed in the shadow of the Appalachians. Hollow Inn, one man wrote in his diary, was a palace at the end of the world. Behind this façade, however, the machinery of death operated with seamless precision. The sisters had learned to space their crimes carefully, never more than a handful each year. They developed stories to explain sudden deaths, a heart attack after too much whiskey, a fever brought from the swamps, a tragic fall from a horse. For those who simply disappeared, it was assumed they had continued west, swallowed by distance. In a land where news traveled slowly and records were sparse, such explanations rarely met challenge. The community, too, protected them. Prudence lent money to farmers who fell into debt. Isolde organized seasonal gatherings, ensuring the inn was always a hub of local life. Morwenna delivered herbs and tinctures to women in childbirth. Hester helped with church socials, her girlish innocence winning sympathy. When rumors of missing men occasionally stirred, neighbors defended the sisters without hesitation. Those girls, one farmer scoffed years later. They'd sooner die themselves than harm a soul. The sisters had constructed not just an inn, but an entire shield of social credibility. It was during these so-called golden years that some of their most chilling victims arrived. A traveling scholar, who Isolde flattered by quoting his own lectures back to him. A wealthy planter's son, undone by Morwenna's medicinal teas. A preacher who confided to Prudence that he had doubts about his faith, only to vanish days later on the road. Each was consumed by the system isolated, softened, poisoned, and erased. Perhaps the most haunting detail of this period is the cemetery. What had begun as a modest family plot grew steadily, though not all graves bore true names. Some were marked with invented ones. Nathaniel, beloved brother, or Jonathan, at peace. To outsiders, it was a family honoring generations of kin. To the sisters, it was camouflage, a grotesque blending of truth and fiction. The cemetery gave respectability to death while hiding its crimes in plain sight. By 1840, Hollow Inn's reputation was so established that travelers deliberately sought it out, taking detours through hostile passes to spend a single night there. Some came for the whiskey, others for the promise of safety. A few came chasing the whispered stories of the Blackwood sisters themselves, tales of their beauty and uncanny hospitality. They arrived full of expectation, unaware they were walking into a carefully woven web. Modern criminologists often remark that this was the most dangerous stage of the sisters' career, the period when success bred confidence. For nearly a decade, they operated with absolute impunity, their wealth growing, their reputation unshaken. It is believed that by the mid-1840s, the number of men erased at Hollow Inn already exceeded 24. Yet, at the time, no one dared to suspect. The inn stood as both beacon and trap, its fires glowing against the night, its hostesses offering smiles that concealed calculation. To most, Hollow Inn was a miracle. Only later would history remember it as something else, a theater of deception, where the warmth of welcome was nothing but the prelude to disappearance. By the early 1840s, the machinery of Hollow Inn was running with a precision that bordered on ritual. Each sister understood her role so thoroughly that the process of ensnaring and eliminating a victim unfolded almost without need for words. It was during these years that some of their most chilling and well-documented crimes took place, each revealing the cold adaptability of the Blackwood system. The first was Caius Dillard, a young engineer working for a railway company surveying possible routes through the Appalachian Highlands. Dillard was 28, intelligent and ambitious, but he traveled alone. He arrived at Hollow Inn in the spring of 1841, weary after weeks in the field with nothing but his maps and measuring instruments. His journal, later recovered among his belongings in Baltimore, described his initial impression. The house is far grander than I expected. 4 sisters run it, each more remarkable than the last. The eldest speaks as though she were a man of business, and the second carries an allure I scarcely dare to describe. Prudence quickly determined that Dillard fit their criteria unmarried. Untethered, and carrying valuable surveying equipment, Isolde took the lead, feigning fascination with his work. She asked him to explain how rails might cut through mountains, her eyes never leaving his face. Dillard, flattered, extended his stay by nearly a week. Meanwhile, Morwenna began administering small doses of foxglove in his evening wine. The symptoms resembled exhaustion palpitations, dizziness, shortness of breath. On the 7th night, after dining privately with Isolde, Dillard collapsed in his chamber. His death was attributed to an overworked heart, an explanation few questioned given his strenuous labor in the mountains. His surveying instruments were quietly sold months later to a merchant in Charleston. His body was interred in the Blackwood Cemetery under a stone carved simply Nathaniel at rest. The second victim of this period was more unsettling doctor, Lucian Caro. a traveling physician in his mid-30s. Caro's practice took him from settlement to settlement, treating patients in exchange for coin or goods. He was known for his curiosity, often recording unusual cases in notebooks he carried with him. In 1842, he passed through Hollow Inn. His presence should have posed a risk the trained eye of a doctor might have noticed Morwenna's manipulations. Yet, it was precisely his curiosity that undid him. Caro found Morwenna's herb garden fascinating. He asked about her tinctures, her drying racks of roots. Morwenna, perhaps flattered, showed him far more than she should have: jars of powders, preserved berries, leaves pressed in oil. Later testimony suggests she even exchanged notes with him, discussing dosages and effects. What Caros did not realize was that Morwenna's interest lay not in curing, but in controlling. Over the course of 3 nights, she began slipping minute quantities of belladonna into his tea. His vision blurred, his speech slurred, and he complained of seeing lights flickering at the corners of the room. Isolde played her role masterfully, insisting that his ailments were nothing more than fatigue, offering comfort by the fire. On his 4th night, Caro was found lifeless in his bed, his face frozen in an expression of confusion. The official explanation recorded by Prudence in the inn's ledger was that he had succumbed to apoplexy, the sudden stroke-like attack that killed many men of his age. His notebooks, however, disappeared. Decades later, scraps of his handwriting were discovered among Morwenna's journals, copied meticulously into her poison records. To the sisters, Caro's knowledge had not been wasted. It had been absorbed. The 3rd victim was Captain Sylvanus Reed, a veteran of the Second Seminole War. Reed was in his early 40s, a broad-shouldered man hardened by campaigns in the Florida swamps. Unlike Dillard or Caro, Reed was not lonely, he was restless. His letters reveal a man who struggled to adjust to civilian life, prone to drinking and gambling. In 1843, on his way north to seek work as a security officer, he stopped at Hollow Inn. Reed presented a different challenge. He was suspicious by nature, wary of strangers, and quick to boast of his experiences. Prudence considered leaving him be, but his visible wealth, a purse heavy with coin from his recent commission, proved too tempting. The sisters adjusted their approach. Rather than relying on Isolde's charms, they used Hester. The young girl's innocence disarmed him. She asked about battles, about soldiers' lives, and Reed, flattered, began to see himself as a mentor, recounting his campaigns to her in the lamplight. While Reed drank heavily each evening, Morwenna introduced pokeweed into his ale. The symptoms mimicked dysentery, a common soldier's ailment. Reed cursed his luck, but dismissed it as nothing unusual. On his 6th night, weakened and half delirious, he stumbled from the common hall towards the stables. There, Olrich Kappell waited. What poison had not finished, the hammer did. Reed's body was dragged into the woods and buried in the caves behind the ridge. His purse and weapons found their way back to Prudence's locked chest. These 3 deaths, an engineer, a doctor, and a soldier, illustrate the sisters' terrifying versatility. They adjusted their tactics to fit each man's seduction for Dillard, intellectual curiosity for Caro, innocent admiration for Reed. They crafted deaths that resembled the hazards of frontier life: heart failure, apoplexy, dysentery, and each disappearance blended seamlessly into the wilderness, raising no alarm. By the mid-1840s, it is estimated that more than 24 men had vanished after passing through Hollow Inn. Some were interred in the family cemetery under false names. Others were hidden in caves, their remains sealed away by stone and time. The sisters had created an ecosystem of murder, each role reinforcing the other, each death feeding both their coffers and their sense of invulnerability. To their neighbors, they remained paragons of respectability. The inn flourished, their whiskey sold widely, their social standing solid. No one suspected that beneath the polished floors and warm fires lay the concealed bones of men whose only mistake had been to accept the sisters' hospitality. The golden years of Hollow Inn were not merely years of prosperity. They were years of slaughter, masked by civility, disguised as kindness. And as the sisters refined their system, they grew bolder, convinced that the wilderness would always keep their secrets. For nearly a decade, Hollow Inn operated like a machine, precise, invisible, unchallenged. Yet even the most finely tuned devices eventually falter. The weakness did not come from lawmen, nor from suspicious travelers, but from within their own circle. The first true crack in the sisters' empire came in the form of Olrich Kappell, the man who had once been their most reliable accomplice. Olrich was a German immigrant, a laborer who arrived in Virginia in the late 1830s. Records suggest he fled debt and hardship in Bavaria, seeking a new life in America's expanding frontier. The Blackwoods employed him initially to tend livestock, repair fences, and manage the heavy labor that 4 women could not easily perform. Yet, before long, Olrich became more than a hired hand. He became indispensable to the darker side of Hollow Inn. He was strong, silent, and obedient. When a body needed moving, Olrich was there. When graves needed to be dug in frozen ground, he lifted the spade. When the caves behind the ridge required concealment, it was Olrich who rolled the stones into place. He asked few questions, accepted his wages, and drank heavily in the evenings by the barn. For years, the arrangement seemed flawless. But complicity exacts its toll. By the late 1840s, Olrich's demeanor had begun to change. Neighbors noticed he spoke less, his eyes shadowed by something heavier than fatigue. He began frequenting the local apothecary, purchasing laudanum, the opium tincture prescribed for pain and sleeplessness. At first, the sisters assumed it was for an old injury, a fall from a horse. He claimed. In truth, it was for something less visible, the burden of memory. Night after night, Olrich dreamed of faces. He saw the wide-eyed shock of Bartholomew Cray, the slack expression of Dr. Lucian Caro, the soldier's stare of Captain Sylvanus Reed. Each time he closed his eyes, they rose before him. The laudanum dulled the visions for a while, but it also loosened his tongue. On more than one occasion, he muttered half-coherent confessions in the tavern of a nearby settlement. Speaking of graves in the hills and gold bought with blood, most dismissed his words as the ravings of a drunk immigrant. But the sisters did not. They listened, and they worried. Prudence was the first to notice the danger. Her ledgers showed increasing purchases of laudanum. She saw Olrich stagger at his work, hands trembling, his once steady eyes unfocused. She pressed him with sharp questions. Was he loyal? Could he be trusted? Olrich swore fidelity, but his oath rang hollow. Prudence confided to Isolde one evening that the laborer had become a liability greater than any traveler. Isolde tried a gentler approach. She sat with him in the barn, speaking in the soft voice that had undone so many men. She asked about his family in Germany, about the reasons he had fled. Olrich wept openly, confessing that he saw their victims every night. 43, he whispered. I count them, again and again. They stand in the corners, watching me. Isolde returned to her sisters shaken, realizing that no seduction or sympathy could undo guilt that deep. Morwenna, ever pragmatic, proposed a solution. They are herbs that quiet the mind, she said, suggesting increased doses of opiates, or perhaps a tincture that would let him sleep without dreams. But Prudence suspected her sister's intent. A larger dose would silence Olrich forever. Hester, uncharacteristically, pleaded for mercy. She had always seen Olrich as more than a servant. He had been kind to her in small ways, carving her a wooden figurine, teaching her German words by the fire. to her. He was not merely an accomplice, but a companion. "He's broken," she argued, "not dangerous. He needs care, not punishment." But the sisters were not in the business of mercy. Their entire enterprise rested on secrecy, and Olrich's unraveling threatened that secrecy at its core. The breaking point came in the winter of 1849, on a bitter February morning. Olrich appeared at the kitchen door, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes disheveled from a sleepless night. Sarah, no. Morwenna was alone preparing breakfast when he staggered in. "I can't do it anymore," he muttered. "I see them. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their voices in the wind. 43 men. 43 souls crying out for justice." His words, though whispered, carried the weight of confession. Morwenna attempted to calm him, speaking gently, urging him to rest. But she knew what the others would decide. That evening, Prudence gathered her sisters. Her verdict was simple: "He knows too much. He will ruin us. The time has come." The plan was executed with the same cold efficiency as any of their murders. They invited Olrich to dine with them in the kitchen, calling it a gesture of gratitude for his years of service. Morwenna poured the wine, spiced heavily to mask the bitter tincture within. Foxglove, in quantities large enough to stop a heart. Olrich drank deeply, grateful for the rare hospitality shown to him. Within hours, he was dead. His body was not buried in the cemetery, nor consigned to the caves. Instead, they dug a shallow grave in the frozen ground behind the barn, covering it hastily with snow and brush. To neighbors, they explained that Olrich had departed suddenly, returning to Germany to see family. Few questioned it. An immigrant laborer's absence stirred little concern, but his death carried consequences the sisters could not erase. Hester wept for days, her innocence cracked by the realization that loyalty and kindness meant nothing against Prudence's ruthless logic. Isolde, for the first time, seemed shaken, her powers of persuasion useless against a man destroyed from within. Morwenna grew colder, recording the effects of the poison in her ledger, as though Olrich were merely another experiment. And Prudence, ever calculating, marked his passing not as tragedy but as necessity. With Olrich gone, the sisters were forced to handle more of the labor themselves. Graves took longer to dig. Bodies were heavier to move. The efficiency of their operation faltered, if only slightly. More importantly, his absence left a silence that none of them could fill, the silence of a man whose conscience, though battered, had nearly shattered their empire from within. Modern historians view Olrich Kappell as the fulcrum on which the Blackwood story turned. Had he confessed openly to authorities, the murders might have ended years earlier. Instead, he was silenced, buried beneath the same soil that covered so many of their victims. But his death marked the beginning of decline. The perfect machine had revealed its first broken gear. The death of Olrich Kappell in 1849 silenced one danger, but it also planted a seed of vulnerability that the sisters could not fully control. For the first time, their machine of murder had faltered, and that hesitation made them careless. It was in this atmosphere of overconfidence and fatigue that they committed the error historians later called the turning point, the disappearance of Septimus Vale. Vale was unlike most of their victims. He was not a drifter or an unremarkable traveler, but a prosperous merchant from Richmond, known for his connections to influential families. In the autumn of 1850, he set out on a journey westward to negotiate trade in timber and coal. His route was unusual, chosen partly out of curiosity, which led him through the narrow valleys of western Virginia. There he encountered Hollow Inn, glowing against the mountains like a beacon. Prudence, calculating as ever, saw opportunity. Vale carried wealth coin. promissory notes, and most dangerously, recognition. Unlike the nameless laborers they so often preyed upon, Septimus Vale's absence would not pass unnoticed. Isolde, however, argued that he was the perfect quarry. "He is a man of appetite," she whispered, "and men of appetite are easy to sate." Against her better instincts, Prudence agreed. From the first night, Isolde played her role with precision. She praised his business acumen, compared him to Roman senators, and feigned admiration for his tales of commerce. Vale, in turn, was delighted by her attention. He extended his stay, claiming fatigue from the journey. The trap tightened. Morwenna prepared her tinctures, while Hester coaxed from him details of his family wealthy brothers, cousins, and a business partner awaiting him in Charleston. Prudence noted it all in her ledger. Yet something was different. Vale was careful. He kept his satchel near at all times, slept with the door locked, and carried a small pistol in his waistcoat. On the third evening, while Isolde entertained him with song at the pianoforte, he remarked, half-jokingly, "One hears stories of inns in the mountains. A man could vanish, and none would know." The sisters froze, but Vale laughed, dismissing his own words. Still, the unease lingered. When the final act came, it was clumsier than their earlier calculated murders. Morwenna slipped belladonna into his wine, but Vale drank sparingly. Hours later, stumbling yet conscious, he attempted to leave, muttering that he would find the road by moonlight. Ulrich's absence was felt keenly that night without his strength. The task of restraining Vale fell to Isolde and Prudence. There was a struggle in the stable, the merchant shouting until Morwenna struck him with a lantern. The blow silenced him, but the chaos left marks: the overturned stool, the broken latch on the stable door, blood that seeped into the dirt too quickly to be scrubbed away. The sisters buried him in haste, not in the cemetery nor the caves, but in a shallow grave near the creek. His satchel was emptied, his papers burned. To them, it seemed the matter was closed. Yet the mistake was fatal. Septimus Vale was not the kind of man who vanished without consequence. Within weeks, letters began to circulate in Richmond. Vale's business partners asked after his whereabouts, noting his absence at crucial meetings. His family pressed for answers. By early winter, word had spread to county officials. It was then that Sheriff Alistair Boonwell entered the story. Boonwell was no ordinary sheriff. A veteran of the Mexican-American War. He had returned to Virginia with a reputation for persistence and an instinct for deception. Where others dismissed disappearances as frontier hazards, Boonwell asked questions. He gathered testimonies from traders, drovers, and itinerant preachers. Again and again, a pattern emerged: men last seen near the ridge where Hollow Inn stood. In December 1850, Boonwell arrived at the inn under the guise of a weary traveler. His notes, preserved in county records, reveal his first impressions. The establishment is well kept, unusually so for this wilderness. The sisters project an air of propriety, but the silence in the halls feels heavier than the mountain fog. He dined with them, observed their manner, Prudence's efficiency, Isolde's charm, Morwenna's measured glances. Hester's childlike questions all seemed rehearsed. For 3 nights, Boonwell stayed, feigning fatigue and an interest in their whiskey. He wandered the grounds, noting the size of the family cemetery, the faint odor of decay near the creek, and the stable latch recently broken and repaired. He did not confront them, not yet. Instead, he departed quietly, leaving behind only a polite note of thanks. The sisters believed they had escaped notice. They were wrong. Boonwell returned to his office with suspicions sharpened. He began compiling a list of missing men: engineers, doctors, soldiers, merchants. At least 20 names aligned with journeys that took them near the Blackwood property. He sent inquiries to neighboring counties, pressed tavern keepers for details, traced possessions that had surfaced in markets far from their owners. Slowly, a web emerged, one whose center pointed to Hollow Inn. The sisters, meanwhile, carried on as before, unaware of how close the storm was. Yet cracks showed. Prudence worried over Boonwell's penetrating gaze. Isolde mocked her fears, insisting no man could resist her charms. Morwenna grew irritable, her garden overgrown as she spent more time staring into the distance. Hester, sensing danger she could not name, prayed aloud at night, her childlike faith beginning to fracture. The murder of Septimus Vale had given them wealth, but it had also given them an enemy. Sheriff Boonwell was not a drifter, nor a drunkard easily swayed. He was a man of law, patience, and resolve. And he was beginning to see through the veil that had protected the Blackwoods for so long. Later historians would describe this moment as the beginning of the end. The sisters had killed with impunity for nearly 20 years. But one careless act, one victim too visible, had drawn the attention of a hunter unlike any they had faced before. The wilderness, which had always concealed their crimes, was about to betray them. By 1851, the shadow hanging over Hollow Inn had grown heavier. Sheriff Alistair Boonwell, driven by a relentless suspicion, began weaving together the first coherent picture of the Blackwood sisters' crimes. What had long been whispered as coincidence or frontier misfortune now crystallized into something darker, a pattern of disappearance that pointed directly to the isolated inn in the mountains. Boonwell's method was patient, deliberate. He began by assembling a ledger of missing men names gathered from court records, tavern gossip, and anguished letters sent from distant families. Caius Dillard, Dr. Lucian Caro, Captain Sylvanus Reed, Septimus Vale, and dozens more. Their trails ended in the same region, always within a day's journey of Hollow Inn. Some had left behind diaries, contracts, or letters mentioning their intention to stay at the fine house run by four sisters. To Boonwell, this was no longer circumstantial, it was damning. The sheriff also spoke to locals, farmers, herders, and traveling preachers. Their testimonies revealed unease long buried beneath politeness. One farmer recalled seeing Olrich Kappell dragging heavy sacks toward the ridge caves at dusk. Another claimed to have heard hammering in the Blackwood cemetery late at night. A preacher described Hester Blackwood's strange questions about sin and forgiveness, asked with the tremulous voice of a child carrying secrets too heavy. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Boonwell knew he needed proof tangible, undeniable evidence that would withstand scrutiny. He began discreetly visiting the ridge himself, under cover of hunting trips. In January 1851, he discovered the first sign, a fragment of cloth half buried in the creek bank, torn and stained, matching the coat worn by Septimus Vale. Days later, while probing near the caves, he unearthed a boot containing the remains of a foot, long decayed but unmistakably human. Word spread slowly but surely. Neighbors whispered of the sheriff's findings, and fear began to gnaw at the community. Hollow Inn, once celebrated as a beacon of hospitality, grew silent. Travelers passed it by, choosing longer routes rather than risk its hearth. The sisters noticed the change. Their tables grew emptier, their profits thinner. Isolde raged at the insult. Prudence grew cold with worry. Morwenna retreated to her tinctures, and Hester wept at night, praying for deliverance none of them deserved. Boonwell's next step was more daring. In March 1851, he returned to the inn, this time with two deputies posing as travelers. For 3 nights they observed, sharing glances, noting the sisters' routines. One deputy later testified that he saw Morwenna stirring something into a guest's wine. Another claimed that Prudence spent hours by candlelight burning papers in the hearth. The sheriff himself walked the cemetery grounds at dawn, counting more graves than there were names in the Blackwood genealogy. It was during this visit that Boonwell confronted Isolde subtly, engaging her in long conversation. She attempted her usual charms, praising his soldier's bearing and flattering his keen eyes. Boonwell played along, even smiled, but later wrote her gaze was that of a predator gauging its prey. Yet, for the first time, I believe she sensed her power failing. By April, Boonwell had enough to act. He presented his findings to the county magistrate, the boot, the cloth, the testimonies of neighbors, the list of missing men. The magistrate, reluctant to accuse women of such standing, hesitated. But mounting pressure from Richmond Vale's family demanding answers forced his hand. A warrant was issued to search Hollow Inn. The raid was planned carefully. Boonwell gathered 6 men, armed and sworn to secrecy. On the morning of May 12, 1851, they rode toward the inn. What they found would later be described as a theater of ghosts. The search of the cemetery revealed bones stacked beneath false gravestones. In the cellar, beneath crates of whiskey, lay personal effects watches, rings, pocket diaries, all belonging to vanished travelers. In Morwenna's chambers were jars of powders and tinctures labeled in her precise hand belladonna, foxglove, hemlock. In Prudence's ledger were entries marked not with names, but with symbols, each coinciding with a date of disappearance. The most damning discovery came in the caves. Guided by a neighbor who recalled Olrich Kappell's late-night labors, Boonwell pried open the sealed stones. Inside lay skeletal remains, dozens of them, some with traces of clothing, some still clutching rusted belt buckles. The stench was unbearable, the silence absolute. One deputy vomited and refused to continue, and Boonwell pressed forward, counting body after body until the number exceeded 30. When confronted with the evidence, the sisters reacted in different ways. Prudence maintained her composure, denying all, insisting the graves were family plots and the possessions left by careless travelers. Isolde attempted to turn her wiles upon Boonwell, declaring her innocence with the tears that quickly soured into fury when met with silence. Morwenna said nothing, only watched with eyes dark as coal. Hester collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, begging forgiveness from both God and man. The community that had once defended them now recoiled in horror. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering of the devil's work done behind those walls. Mothers pulled children close. Men spat in the dirt, unwilling to speak the sisters' names. Hollow Inn, once a sanctuary, was revealed as a charnel house. Sheriff Boonwell wasted no time. The sisters were arrested and taken under heavy guard to the county jail. The inn was sealed, its doors barred, its windows shuttered. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the Blackwoods were separated from their stage, stripped of the façade that had shielded them. Yet, even in chains, they were not broken. Prudence sat rigid, whispering to herself. Isolde laughed bitterly, mocking the deputies. Morwenna hummed as though to lull unseen children to sleep. Only Hester clung to Boonwell's coat, pleading that she never meant to harm. The trial was yet to come, but the investigation of Hollow Inn had already shaken Virginia to its core. What had been dismissed as frontier rumor was now written in bone and blood. The Blackwood sisters' reign of silence was over, and their reckoning had begun. The arrest of the Blackwood sisters in 1851 sent shockwaves through Virginia and beyond. Newspapers seized upon the story, calling it the Hollow Inn Horrors and the Witches of the Ridge. For years, rumors of vanished men had been whispered in taverns and along wagon roads. But now the whispers had faces 4 women of standing, accused of murder on a scale scarcely imaginable. The trial promised spectacle, and spectacle it delivered. The proceedings opened in July 1851 at the county courthouse, a squat brick building suddenly overrun with journalists, merchants, and curious onlookers. Sheriff Alistair Boonwell presented his evidence methodically: the possessions found in the cellar, the ledger of symbols, the tinctures in Morwenna's room, and the grisly remains unearthed in the caves. Witnesses testified to strange noises at night, to travelers last seen walking toward Hollow Inn, to Olrich Kappell's drunken mutterings about graves and blood. The sisters were brought into court in shackles. Prudence walked first, head high, her expression cold and defiant. Isolde followed with a faint smile, as though mocking the crowd that hissed at her beauty. Morwenna appeared gaunt, her eyes black hollows that unsettled even the judge. Hester clung to her chains, weeping openly. Prudence acted as the group's mouthpiece, denying everything. She claimed the cemetery was filled only with kin, that the possessions had been abandoned or bartered, that Boonwell had conjured phantoms from shadows. But when the satchel of Septimus Vale was produced, with his family crest etched into the leather, her mask cracked, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Isolde attempted a different defense seduction, even in captivity. She addressed the jury directly, insisting she was a victim of slander, her soft voice weaving between accusation and plea. Some men faltered under her gaze, but Boonwell's ledger of missing names weighed heavier. Morwenna spoke little, only once muttering. The herbs speak for themselves. I kept records. When her journals were read aloud, detailing dosages of foxglove and belladonna matched against dates of deaths, the courtroom grew silent with horror. Hester's testimony proved the most damaging of all. Whether from guilt or terror, she broke. On the third day, sobbing uncontrollably, she confessed that the sisters had fed the earth with men for nearly 20 years. She described the process Isolde's lures, Morwenna's tinctures, Prudence's calculations, and her own role as the innocent mask. Her words confirmed every suspicion, every dark rumor. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated less than a day. The verdict was unanimous guilty of multiple counts of murder. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at the county gallows. The announcement sparked frenzy. Some called for immediate execution. Others demanded the sisters be burned as witches. Ministers declared the trial proof of Satan's hand in the wilderness. Families of missing men traveled for days to attend the sentencing, clutching mementos of sons and brothers lost. On September 6, 1851, the Blackwood sisters were led to the scaffold before a crowd of nearly 1,000. Accounts describe the atmosphere as both carnival and funeral. Vendors sold cider and bread. Children perched on shoulders. Preachers shouted warnings of sin. Prudence mounted the steps without falter, her eyes scanning the crowd as though daring them to look away. Isolde blew a kiss toward the jeering men. Morwenna muttered prayers or curses witnesses disagreed which. Hester collapsed, needing to be carried. When the nooses were placed, Prudence spoke her final words. The earth remembers. You cannot bury what is already in its roots. Moments later, the trapdoors fell. 4 bodies swung in the autumn air, and the crowd roared with both satisfaction and unease. Hollow Inn was abandoned. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed. Windows shattered, doors rotted, and ivy consumed its walls. Travelers whispered of strange sounds in the empty hall's footsteps, laughter, the faint clink of glasses. Some swore they saw 4 women watching from the upper windows, their faces pale against the dark. Sheriff Boonwell continued in office for years, though the trial marked him indelibly. His journals reveal recurring dreams of the caves, of skeletons reaching out with accusing hands. He died in 1863, still convinced that not all the victims had been found. The legend of the Blackwoods only grew. Songs were written, sermons preached. Children were warned that if they strayed into the woods, the sisters will find you. Even today, hikers speak of the Hollow Inn curse, and amateur historians seek the caves where bones once lay. Some claim the land itself resists habitation, crops wither. Animals shy away, houses collapse. Modern scholars debate the true scale of the killings. Conservative estimates place the number at 30. Others claim more than 50. The sisters' motives remain disputed greed, misandry, or simply the thrill of power. Yet, all agree on one thing: the Blackwoods shattered the illusion of safety in the frontier. They proved that evil could wear the face of hospitality, that behind the warmth of a hearth might lurk the silence of a grave. The story of Hollow Inn endures because it is more than a tale of murder. It is a story of trust betrayed, of wilderness turned into hunting ground, of women who subverted the roles society imposed upon them and wielded them as weapons. And it is a reminder that in the dark corners of history, not all the dead rest easy. Even now, in the ruins of Hollow Inn, the wind seems to carry whispers. Some say they are only the echoes of mountains. Others, standing alone in the moonlit clearing, swear they hear 4 voices, still plotting, still waiting,